The room was quiet except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Colonel Marcus, a decorated officer with over 2 decades of service, sat at his desk reviewing the details of his next mission. It wasn't a mission of strategy or battle, but it carried a weight unlike any other. He had been chosen to escort the remains of a young soldier who had fallen in the line of duty. For a moment, Marcus leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The soldier, Private First Class James Hall, was only 21 years old. He had dreams, ambitions, and a family waiting to see him again. But instead of joyful reunions, they would face a painful farewell. Marcus knew this duty wasn't just about carrying a casket. It was about honoring the sacrifice of a life given for their country. He thought of the Hall family, especially James's mother, who would be waiting at the airport. The thought tightened Marcus's chest. "I will do this right," he whispered to himself, knowing how important it was to carry out this solemn task with dignity and respect. Marcus prepared carefully. He polished his dress uniform until it gleamed, pressed every crease into place, and checked every detail twice. As a black man in a high-ranking position, he was no stranger to being scrutinized. He had spent his career proving himself, not just as a capable officer, but as someone who could stand tall against bias and doubt. Today, however, wasn't about him. It was about James and his family. With his bag packed and his orders in hand, Marcus headed to the base where the transport plane awaited. The remains of Private Hall were loaded with care, draped in the American flag. Marcus placed his hand gently on the casket for a moment of silence, his mind filled with thoughts of honor, sacrifice, and the promise to give this mission everything he had. The first leg of the journey went smoothly. The plane landed at a civilian airport for a layover, and Marcus prepared to transfer to a commercial flight for the final part of the trip. He approached the airline counter, his uniform crisp and his posture straight. He explained his purpose clearly, showing his military orders and the paperwork authorizing the transport. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up. "I don't see anything special about this ticket," she said dismissively, her tone cold. Marcus felt a pang of irritation but stayed calm. "Ma'am, I'm escorting a fallen soldier. This is a military-sanctioned duty." Her expression didn't change. "We have rules," she said curtly. "You'll need to wait or rebook like everyone else." Marcus stood there, stunned by her response. This wasn't just about him. It was about the sacred duty he had been given. But instead of respect, he was met with indifference. Taking a deep breath, he remained composed. He wasn't about to let this situation deter him from his mission. As he stepped aside, Marcus knew this was only the beginning of a much larger challenge. Colonel Marcus stood to the side of the bustling airport terminal, clutching the paperwork for his flight. His mind replayed the cold response he had just received from the airline clerk. The indifference stung, but it wasn't about him. It was about the young soldier whose casket he was accompanying. He reminded himself of the mission: honor and dignity for Private James Hall and his grieving family. Marcus looked at the large clock on the wall. Time was slipping away, and the connection to his final flight was getting closer. If he missed it, he would delay the soldier's journey home, a thought that weighed heavily on his heart. He took a deep breath and walked back to the counter, determined to try again. "Excuse me," he said politely to the clerk. "I'd like to speak to a supervisor. It's important." The clerk barely glanced up. "You'll have to wait," she said, her tone dismissive. Marcus felt frustration rise but kept his composure. He was used to obstacles, having faced his fair share during his years of service. Instead of arguing, he stepped back and looked around the terminal. Other passengers were moving about, oblivious to the significance of his presence. Yet he couldn't shake the growing sense that this journey wasn't going as it should. As Marcus stood there, a man approached. He was older, with a military insignia on his jacket, a retired officer. "Colonel," the man said, his voice kind but firm, "I overheard what happened. Is there an issue with your flight?" Marcus explained the situation briefly, keeping his tone professional. The retired officer listened, his brows furrowing. "That's unacceptable," he said. "Let me help." Together, they approached the counter again. The retired officer, whose name was Mr. Daniels, addressed the clerk directly. "Ma'am, this man is a colonel in the United States military escorting the remains of a fallen soldier. Show some respect and find a solution." The clerk hesitated, her face reddening slightly under the firm yet polite words. She tapped on her keyboard but still seemed reluctant to help. "I told him already. He has to wait," she muttered. At that moment, other passengers began to notice the interaction. A woman standing nearby spoke up. "He's doing something important. Can't you see that?" Another voice chimed in. "You should help him. This isn't right." Soon, a small crowd had gathered, watching the scene unfold. The murmurs of support grew louder, and the clerk looked increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, she called her supervisor, who arrived quickly and took over. The supervisor listened to Marcus's explanation, checked the paperwork, and nodded. "Colonel, I apologize for the inconvenience. Let me get this sorted for you immediately." Within minutes, Marcus's boarding pass was reissued, and he was assured his seat was secure. Though grateful for the outcome, Marcus couldn't ignore the feeling that this experience represented a deeper issue, one that many had faced in silence. As he prepared to board, Marcus thanked Mr. Daniels and the others who had spoken up. Their actions reminded him that sometimes even small voices could make a big difference. But this was far from the end of the story. Colonel Marcus felt a small wave of relief as he finally received his boarding pass. The support from strangers and the retired officer, Mr. Daniels, had been unexpected but deeply appreciated. Yet, as he approached the gate, he couldn't shake the tension in his chest. The earlier incident still lingered in his mind. He made his way to the boarding area, standing straight in his crisp uniform with his hat tucked under his arm. He noticed a few passengers giving him respectful nods, which reassured him that some people understood the gravity of his mission. Still, a part of him couldn't forget the dismissive treatment he had faced. As boarding began, Marcus was among the first to step forward. The gate agent scanned his ticket, but then paused, glancing at her screen. "Just a moment, sir," she said, her voice hesitant. Marcus frowned slightly, feeling a sense of déjà vu. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. The agent avoided eye contact. "It seems your seat has been reassigned. Let me check with my manager." Before Marcus could respond, another passenger stepped forward, a middle-aged man in a business suit. "Excuse me, but I think this gentleman has priority," the man said, pointing to Marcus's uniform. "He's clearly on official duty." The gate agent glanced between them nervously. "I'm sorry, but I have to follow the system. Please wait while I sort this out." Marcus stepped aside, his patience wearing thin. This was the second time on this journey that he had faced unnecessary obstacles. He knew that wearing the uniform often brought respect, but it also came with moments like this. Moments where he had to fight to be seen, to be treated fairly. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus noticed whispers spreading among the passengers nearby. Some looked confused, others concerned. Finally, the gate agent returned with her manager, a younger man who looked uneasy. "Colonel Marcus, we've reviewed your ticket," the manager said, his tone apologetic but firm. "It seems there was an error in seating, and we don't have an available seat in first class at this time." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he said, his voice steady. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier. This mission isn't about me. It's about honoring that soldier." The manager hesitated, but before he could respond, a voice from the crowd interrupted. "I'll give him my seat." A young woman stepped forward, holding out her boarding pass. "Take mine," she said firmly. "You deserve it more than I do." Another passenger chimed in. "If he doesn't take hers, he can have mine." One by one, others in the boarding area began offering their seats, their voices filled with conviction. The gate agent and manager looked overwhelmed, and after a moment, they nodded. "Colonel, we'll ensure you're on this flight. Please accept our apologies." Marcus boarded the plane, humbled by the kindness of strangers. Yet, as he settled into his seat, he couldn't ignore the lingering question. Why had it taken a crowd of voices to ensure he was treated fairly? This journey was turning into more than just a mission of duty. It was becoming a reflection of something much larger. As the plane lifted off and the city lights below began to fade, Colonel Marcus looked out of the window, trying to clear his mind of the events that had unfolded earlier. The long journey had taken an emotional toll, but he knew he couldn't let the frustration overshadow his mission. The task at hand was far too important. He glanced down at the casket of Private James Hall, carefully stowed away in the cargo hold. The soldier's family was waiting, and Marcus's duty was to bring their loved one home with the respect he deserved. His thoughts kept returning to the Hall family, especially the young man's mother, who would never see her son again. This journey wasn't about himself. It was about giving James's sacrifice the honor it truly deserved. When the plane finally landed at the next airport, Marcus stepped off with a sense of determination. The layover was brief, but he still had to navigate through the busy terminal to catch the connecting flight. His uniform stood out among the crowd, and some people noticed him as he walked past. He could feel their eyes on him, some with admiration, some with curiosity, and others with indifference. As he approached the airline counter to check in for his final leg of the journey, the feeling of unease crept in again. The same emotions from earlier bubbled up inside him. Would he face more resistance? Would he have to fight again for the simple respect he deserved? He approached the counter, where a different agent was working. She glanced at him briefly before returning to her paperwork. "How can I help you?" she asked, barely looking up. "I'm Colonel Marcus," he said, presenting his documents. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier back home to his family. I just need to check in for my flight." The agent's eyes flicked to the papers, and then back to him. "I see," she said, her tone neutral. "Please wait a moment." Marcus stood there, waiting in silence. His thoughts raced. He tried not to let his frustration show, but it was hard. He had been through too much already. Why was it so difficult for some people to simply recognize the importance of his mission? A few minutes passed, and the agent finally returned with his boarding pass. She handed it to him without saying much else. "Your flight is delayed by about 30 minutes. Please be seated and wait for the final call." Marcus nodded, thanking her quietly. As he made his way to the seating area, he could feel the weight of the eyes on him again. It wasn't just the long hours of travel that were wearing him down. It was the subtle, sometimes open, resistance he had been facing throughout this journey. As he sat down, a deep sense of exhaustion washed over him. He didn't want to carry the burden of injustice, but it was clear that some people would never fully understand the importance of his mission, just as some would never understand the weight of his uniform. But he couldn't let that stop him. He couldn't let their ignorance take away the honor he was determined to give to Private James Hall. This mission was bigger than himself, and no matter how many obstacles he faced, he would see it through. The final leg of the flight was a long one. Marcus sat by the window, gazing out at the vast sky. The discomfort from earlier was still fresh in his mind, but his focus remained on the task at hand. He knew he had to be strong for the family waiting at the destination, for the mother who would never hold her son again. His duty was bigger than any personal inconvenience. As the plane cruised steadily through the clouds, Marcus noticed a quiet unease growing inside him. The earlier experience with the airline staff had left him feeling small, as if his role in this journey wasn't being respected. His eyes flicked over the passengers around him. Some were reading, others were lost in their own thoughts, but none seemed to notice the weight of his mission. He was just another man in uniform to most of them. When the plane made its descent toward the final airport, Marcus's heart skipped a beat. His mind wandered back to Private James Hall's family, wondering how they were coping. He had to make it on time. He had to do this right. After landing, Marcus stood with the rest of the passengers and prepared to leave the plane. He grabbed his bag and moved toward the aisle, feeling the eyes of other passengers on him once again. This time, It wasn't out of curiosity or confusion, but a kind of silent recognition. Some of them offered him small nods or quiet smiles. As Marcus reached the gate and approached the airport terminal, he noticed a woman standing a few steps ahead. She was holding her son's hand, looking anxiously at the arrival board. She seemed lost in thought, but then looked up and saw him. It was the mother of another soldier who had been deployed overseas. "Colonel," she asked softly. Her voice was calm, but there was something in her eyes, an understanding of what he was going through. She had heard the news of the fallen soldiers and had seen his uniform. She had seen the same commitment in her own husband's eyes when he had gone overseas. She knew the burden he carried. Marcus looked up, slightly startled by her sudden recognition. "Yes, ma'am," he answered with a respectful nod. "I overheard your conversation at the gate earlier." The woman continued. "What they did to you, it's wrong." Marcus was taken aback. He hadn't expected anyone to acknowledge the injustice he had faced. He had been quietly fighting his own battle inside, but now, here was someone standing beside him, validating his struggle. The woman placed a hand on his shoulder. "I've seen my husband go through similar things. It's not right, but don't let it shake you. You're doing something much bigger than they'll ever understand." Her words, simple yet filled with truth, gave Marcus the reassurance he needed. It wasn't about the people who didn't understand his mission. It wasn't about the discomfort or the unfair treatment. It was about the soldier he was escorting and the sacrifice James Hall had made for their country. That was what mattered most. As the woman walked away, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world might not always recognize the weight of his duty, but he would continue to carry it with pride. And as he moved forward, he knew that no matter what happened, he would finish the journey with the respect and honor that Private Hall and his family deserved. After the brief exchange with the kind woman, Colonel Marcus felt a new sense of strength. The unfair treatment he had faced earlier, though still lingering in his thoughts, no longer felt as significant. He reminded himself that his mission was far greater than the actions of a few ignorant individuals. Private James Hall's sacrifice would not go unhonored. It was this realization that kept him moving forward. Once Marcus arrived at his final destination, the solemn duty of delivering the remains to the Hall family took center stage. He met with the soldiers' parents, who were deeply grateful but heartbroken. The grief in their eyes made Marcus's resolve even stronger. This moment, he realized, was what truly mattered. But little did Marcus know, the story of his struggle at the airport had begun to spread. Word of the way he had been treated, of the injustice he faced while simply performing his duty, quickly made its way to social media. Passengers on the flight had taken to their phones, sharing their experience of witnessing Marcus's treatment. Some had recorded parts of the incident, and the video was now making its rounds across the internet. At first, it was just a handful of posts, but as the hours passed, the story gained momentum. The hashtags #RespectOurHeroes and #BlackColonel went viral. People from all over began sharing their outrage over what had happened, and messages of support flooded in. The backlash against the airline was swift and intense. Marcus had no idea that this was unfolding. He was focused entirely on his task, ensuring that James Hall's remains reached his family with the honor and care he deserved. However, back in the airport, things were rapidly changing. The airline was receiving a storm of angry messages from customers and military families alike. Soon, the story reached the airline's higher-ups. They had no choice but to respond. The pressure was mounting, and the public's anger was impossible to ignore. In the midst of all the complaints, the airline's social media team quickly issued a public statement. "We deeply regret the incident involving Colonel Marcus. We failed to show the proper respect and consideration to a member of the military, and for that, we apologize. This will be addressed immediately." While the apology was a step in the right direction, it wasn't enough to quell the growing outrage. Many people felt that the airline was only responding due to public pressure rather than genuine remorse. News outlets began covering the story, and it became a topic of national conversation. People across the country debated the treatment of military personnel, particularly those who faced discrimination because of their race. For Marcus, hearing about the backlash was a mixed experience. He appreciated the support, but he wasn't looking for attention or sympathy. He never expected that his quiet mission would become a symbol of the broader struggles facing many service members, especially black officers, in the military and beyond. Yet, in the end, the story did spark change. The airline made a commitment to better training for its staff, ensuring that future service members would not face similar treatment. More than that, the incident helped open a conversation about respect, equality, and the importance of recognizing the sacrifices of those who serve their country, no matter their race or background. And through it all, Marcus continued his mission, focused solely on the family and the soldier whose sacrifice he had been entrusted to honor. As the days passed, the waves of public support for Colonel Marcus continued to grow. The airline, faced with mounting criticism, promised changes and offered their public apologies. However, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that all of this attention, all of this fallout, was drawing focus away from the real reason he was on this journey: Private James Hall's sacrifice and the mourning family he was escorting home. Marcus had finished his duty, delivering the soldiers' remains with the utmost care and respect. He had attended the funeral, standing alongside the family as they said their goodbyes. In those quiet moments, he felt the weight of his responsibility. This was the true honor, the small personal acts of respect that could never be overshadowed by public attention. But the world outside was changing. The media continued to cover the story of the treatment he faced, interviewing fellow passengers who had witnessed the injustice. People who didn't know Marcus personally were calling for justice, wanting to see real changes made in how service members were treated by the public and by corporations. His experience was no longer just his own. It had become a larger symbol of inequality that demanded change. Yet, through it all, Marcus remained humble. He was a man of action, not words, and he wasn't interested in being anyone's hero. His focus had always been on doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy. To him, the attention felt uncomfortable, but it also served a purpose. It was creating change, and perhaps this was how things needed to be in order to make a difference. A few days later, Marcus received a personal letter from the CEO of the airline. The letter was both an apology and a statement of intent. The airline acknowledged their failure in treating him with the respect he deserved and vowed to implement new policies to ensure that military personnel, particularly black service members, were not subjected to the same disrespect in the future. It was an important first step, and Marcus appreciated the effort. But what meant even more to him was the gesture that followed. The CEO invited him to a special ceremony, an event meant to honor military personnel and highlight the changes the airline would be making. It wasn't much, but it was a small step towards righting the wrong. Marcus agreed to attend, not for the attention or the recognition, but because it represented a commitment to doing better. On the day of the ceremony, the airport was filled with people, military families, veterans, and civilians, gathered to honor the service of men and women who had given their time, and sometimes their lives, for their country. The ceremony was emotional, and as Marcus stood on stage, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come in his journey. When he was called up to the podium, the room fell silent. The CEO of the airline spoke first, expressing his gratitude and offering his apology once again. Then Marcus was given a moment to speak. He stood before the crowd, feeling the weight of all the eyes on him. "Thank you for your kindness," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is not just about me. It's about every person who serves, who sacrifices. It's about honoring the memory of those we've lost and treating each other with dignity, no matter who we are or where we come from." The applause that followed wasn't just for Marcus. It was for every person who had ever been treated unfairly, for every voice that had ever been silenced. And as he stepped down from the stage, Marcus felt a quiet sense of peace. The story had become more than just his own. It had become a turning point for others, a reminder of the power of respect, equality, and the need for change. And though the journey wasn't over, Marcus knew that his actions, along with the support of others, had helped make the world a little bit better. That was all he had ever hoped for. The days after the ceremony were filled with a quiet sense of relief for Colonel Marcus. The media attention had slowly faded, and the anger and confusion over the incident had begun to settle. It was clear that the airline had taken steps to improve its policies, but Marcus knew that true change would take time. In his heart, he remained focused on what had always mattered the most: the mission, the duty, and the sacrifice of the fallen soldier he had escorted home. After the public apology and ceremony, Marcus returned to his life as a military officer. He went back to his duties as any soldier would. Yet there was a quiet satisfaction that stayed with him. It wasn't about the attention. It was about how his actions had sparked a wider conversation, one that made people stop and think about how they treated those who served their country, particularly those from marginalized communities. But for Marcus, the journey wasn't over. He had one last task to complete: the final handoff of Private James Hall's belongings to his grieving mother, who had awaited the return of her son's remains. The funeral was held in a small, peaceful cemetery, and Marcus stood alongside the Hall family as they bid farewell. The ceremony was simple but deeply emotional. As the American flag draped over James's casket was folded carefully and presented to his mother, Marcus stood at attention. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment, the weight of all that had been sacrificed. James Hall was just one of many soldiers who had given everything for their country, but his death was the one Marcus had been entrusted with. The mother's tearful expression as she received her son's flag was a reminder of why he had taken on this duty. It wasn't just about the formalities of military life. It was about the lives that were touched, the hearts that were broken, and the families left behind. After the ceremony, Marcus approached James's mother, who was standing by the grave. She looked up at him, her face pale and drawn with grief, but there was a spark of gratitude in her eyes. She didn't say much, but she didn't need to. Her eyes spoke volumes of appreciation for the care and dignity Marcus had shown in bringing her son home. "I'm so sorry for your loss, ma'am," Marcus said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "He was a hero, and I promise you, we'll never forget him." She nodded, tears slipping down her face, but she managed a small smile. "Thank you, Colonel," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing him home." Marcus stood there for a moment, his heart heavy but full of respect for the woman who had lost her child. There was nothing he could say that would make her pain go away, but he hoped that in some small way he had honored her son's memory and given her a moment of peace. As he left the cemetery, Marcus took one last look at the grave. The sky was slowly turning pink with the setting sun, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. He had done his duty, and in doing so, he had fulfilled something greater than any mission he had ever taken on. The journey wasn't over, but Marcus had made a difference, not through recognition or public acclaim, but through quiet actions and dedication to what was right. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Weeks had passed since Colonel Marcus had returned home from his mission. The story of his experience, the treatment he had faced, and the overwhelming support from people all over the country still lingered in the news. It had sparked a much-needed conversation about how service members were treated, particularly those who, like Marcus, often had to fight against prejudice and inequality in their careers. Marcus wasn't one to seek attention, but he realized that the story had become bigger than him. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about how the treatment of military personnel, especially black officers, was often overlooked or dismissed. The journey had brought attention to the struggles that many service members faced on a daily basis, both on the job and in their personal lives. Despite the challenges, Marcus felt an incredible sense of peace. His mission to honor Private James Hall had been completed with dignity, and in doing so, he had brought a greater understanding of respect and the importance of recognizing the sacrifices of all those who serve their country. The Hall family was grateful for his efforts, and Marcus knew that the memory of their son, along with countless others, would be honored for years to come. The airline, after facing immense public pressure, had followed through on its promises to make changes. They had implemented new policies to ensure that service members would be treated with the respect they deserved. Training for employees was updated, focusing not only on how to assist military personnel, but also on understanding the significance of their roles and the sacrifices they made. It wasn't perfect, and Marcus knew it would take time for real change to happen. But it was a start. What meant the most to Marcus, however, was the shift in the larger conversation. More and more people were becoming aware of the challenges that military families and personnel faced, and they were speaking out. The outrage over what had happened to Marcus had not only brought the issue to light, but it had also sparked a movement of support for the men and women in uniform. People from all walks of life began to understand that the honor and respect given to those who served in the military should be unconditional, regardless of their race, background, or station in life. The day after the ceremony honoring the fallen soldiers, Marcus received a letter. It wasn't from a government official or anyone in the public eye. Instead, it was from a young man, one who had been inspired by Marcus's story. The letter spoke of how the young man had always dreamed of joining the military, but had been hesitant, unsure of how he would be received. After hearing about Marcus's experience and the outpouring of support, the young man had found the courage to apply and was now awaiting his acceptance. That letter meant more to Marcus than any award or recognition he had ever received. It wasn't about the attention. It was about the legacy he had helped create. A legacy that would continue to inspire others to serve with honor, to fight against injustice, and to stand up for what was right. As Marcus looked out the window of his office, he knew that while this chapter of his life had come to a close, the ripple effects of what had happened would continue to grow. The world was slowly changing, and he had been a part of that change. That, he thought, was the most powerful legacy of all.